refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. I take refuge in the Buddha, the teacher of the truth, and I wish that all sentient beings might awaken to the great path and make the ultimate resolution. I take refuge in the Dharma, the truth, and I wish that all sentient beings might delve into the scriptures, their wisdom deep as the ocean. I take refuge in the Sangha, the community of those dedicated to the truth, and I wish that all sentient beings might be brought together in great harmony, without any obstructions at all. I have taken refuge in the Buddha. I have taken refuge in the Dharma. I have taken refuge in the Sangha. May the merit of this refuge-taking benefit all disciples of the Buddha. May the merit of this refuge-taking benefit all living beings. May the benefits of this refuge-taking benefit all solitary and wandering spirits. Before I share this, I thought I would share a brief story. When Zen Buddhism was first becoming, I don't want to say in vogue, but it was starting to have an influence in the West, especially on the coast, there was an 80-year-old Japanese monk. And what a lot of Westerners don't know is that the last figure I saw was that almost 90% of Japanese Zen Buddhist monks are married. And this master was married. And his wife died. Later that week, in their practice together, the old master started weeping. These Western students were scandalized. Master, what are you doing? You're supposed to be a Buddhist master. And he looked at them like they were crazy. He said, I was married to her for over 50 years. I'm going to miss her. Something that was taught to me and something that I share with every seeker who finds me is that Buddhism does not promise to make you happy. It only wants you to be human. The Buddha said it is a very hard thing to be born a human being, but it is a much harder thing to live like a human being. In our practice of living as human beings, I want to share with you the 5 remembrances. These are 5 things that Kirby and I and all those who share our practice are encouraged to remind ourselves of every single day. I am of a nature to grow old. There is no way to avoid growing old. I am of a nature to become sick. There is no way to avoid becoming sick. I am of a nature to die. There is no way to avoid death. Everything and everyone I care about is impermanent. They are of a nature to change and to pass away. There is no way to avoid such loss. All of my thoughts, words, and deeds are subject to the law of karma. There is no way to avoid the consequences for which they are the causes. You may say, why would you remind yourself of these things every day? These are the very things that most people spend a lot of money and time and energy trying not to think about. When I share the answer to that, I think you'll see what the appeal of the Buddha's teaching was to someone like Kirby. I never knew Kirby to wear his religious practice on his sleeve, and there may be some here who didn't even know that Kirby was deeply involved in the Zen Buddhist community. He was ordained in San Francisco in 1994 by Master Fat Wei. In 2004, he was ordained brother of our shared religious order, the Shuyan Genuine, or Zen Buddhist Order of Shuyun. In 2012, he received full Dharma transmission as a senior brother of the order. His name was recorded in the register at Nanhua in China. In common parlance, you may say that Kirby was identified as a genuine Zen master, though not many would ever guess. Having gotten to know Kirby, it isn't difficult to see what drew him to this way. These 5 remembrances are an important part of our practice. This is how Sakyamuni Buddha began his very first sermon preached 2,600 years ago. Brothers, why do I call my path the right path? I call it the right path because it does not avoid or deny suffering, but allows for a direct confrontation with suffering as the means to overcome it. Kirby was never one to avoid or deny suffering. Direct confrontation was definitely his style. That's why he sat quietly in meditation. He wasn't shrinking away from it. He wasn't avoiding or denying his suffering. He was confronting it. I lived in a monastery for a short time, and when someone visited, they said, it must be so peaceful here. I mean, the monks are all so quiet. I said, when they're the quietest, it's when they're working the hardest. They work the fields to relax. It was Kirby's practice to remain open to his suffering. In our tradition, compassion doesn't mean something sickly sweet or romantic. Compassion is simply remaining open, resisting that natural urge to turn away, to avoid, to deny. To encounter life as it is in a direct confrontation with all of its messiness, all of its pain, all of its joy, all of its beauty. As we understand it, that is the nature of compassion. To have compassion on himself, if I may be so bold as to say it, was not Kirby's first nature. But only by remaining open to his experience of himself and of all the world around him did he believe he could look closely in search of awakening realization. This was his discipline and his practice set forth by the Buddha, not to avoid or deny suffering, but to confront it. For himself, I saw this discipline generating patient endurance of suffering and injustice. I don't want to get started on the injustices of our modern health care, but it's enough to say Kirby was at the butt end of it. He would patiently endure, though a sharply honest word was never far from his lips. What defines Kirby in my mind more than anything else, however, is not the way he directly confronted his own suffering and injustice. It was Kirby's consistent practice of directly confronting the suffering and injustice of others. Where he met his own suffering with a manly effort to patiently endure, whether he succeeded or not, there was nothing patient about the way that he directly confronted suffering and injustice against others. I didn't know Kirby to avoid or deny the suffering and injustice of others, nor to tolerate those around him who wanted to. With his sharp mind and his wit, with his words, both spoken and written, and with his activism, Kirby certainly put into practice the Buddha's first teaching, that the way to overcome is not by retreat, but by confrontation. Early in my relationship with Kirby as a student, I have to confess his activism in both word and deed seemed a little bit off-putting. I wondered how such a confrontational and outspoken person could ever have become a Zen master. I didn't understand how it could be compatible with the Buddha's teaching. And I'm very grateful to Kirby that as my teacher, he showed me how. And so I turn now to all of you, and I encourage you to share this practice, both with regard to your own suffering and with regard to the suffering and the injustice you see around you. It is hard not to deny or avoid your own suffering. The fourth remembrance with which I open is truth. There is no way to avoid loss. This is probably not your first memorial service. And unless you are the guest of honor at your next one, it probably will not be your last, will it? I've been to many funeral services. I've conducted a number. And it's unfortunate that I can report to you now that many have been tools of avoidance and denial instead of tools for direct confrontation. I encourage you to look within yourself, to take advantage of this memorial service, not to deny or avoid, but to confront. Look within yourself, acknowledge your suffering, and don't shrink away from it. That's how you overcome. Not by sweeping it under a rug of platitudes, drowning it in drink or busyness or false smiles. By looking closely at your own suffering, you may be able to pick apart the strands that make it up. I promise it's not purely the loss of Kirby that bothers you, but also the reminder that you are of a nature to grow old. You are of a nature to become sick. You are of a nature to die. Everyone and everything that you love is also of such a nature. Only with compassion and willingness not to turn away from your own suffering can you look closely enough at it to see the deep truth your suffering is covering. Don't be compassionate towards only your suffering. Resist the urge to deny and avoid the suffering of those around you. Not only tonight, but at all times. When you see suffering and injustice, act. If you don't act, speak. If you don't speak, post a cynical political meme on Facebook. And sometimes the hardest discipline is to say and do nothing when that is most appropriate. Because sometimes we can mask our denial and avoidance of others' suffering with activism. You are all precious human beings, and I trust all of you can use your own wisdom to make sense of that. I wouldn't share what I'm sharing tonight out of respect for the diversity of religious opinion that may be present if I didn't believe that what I was sharing was universal. St. Paul wrote to the Roman Christians, "Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn." But he wrote this in service to this cause, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. He too seemed to think that mourning with those who mourn was an important part of overcoming evil with good. If it is your desire to begin to live this practice, or to continue to live this practice of not denying and not avoiding, but compassionately and directly confronting your own suffering, maybe even as Kirby did, with some peppery speech and choice words. I share this verse by one of Kirby's favorite poets, the master of Cold Mountain. The yellow river is boundless, flowing east without ceasing, on and on, never clearing, while everyone's lifespan ends. And if you would ride the clouds, how will you grow wings? Unless while your hair is still black, you make an effort, moving or still. I remember the first time I met Kirby for tea. I share this in closing. We walked side by side. He was hobbling along on his cane. I didn't get to know him until after his surgery, which he affectionately referred to as when he was gutted from stem to stern. He hobbled around Fayetteville Square with me, and I don't remember what prompted his comment, but I remember what he said. After I die, I will be mountains and rivers. I glanced at him, and a little cheekily as a new student might, I said, "How can you say, though, I will be?" He walked on for a few steps in thought, and then he said, "Fair enough. After I die, just mountains and rivers." And so in honor of my friend and my teacher, I say, just mountains and rivers. This time I invite you to stand as I ring the bell for Kirby. God, I'll shock you 9 times.
Probably not oldest friend, but longest standing friend that's still speaking to him. Thank you, Mark. I only got the pleasure of knowing Mark after Kirby was in the hospital. In my rush in and out to get everything done, work, check on Kirby and go to the hospital and all the things that you do in a day. Mark was there several times when I would come as a quiet, cool peace, and I know it gave Kirby peace when he was in the hospital. And it gave him joy to have to be in So I want to thank you for that, and this beautiful service. Well, Kirby Sanders shuffled off this mortal coil on Thursday, May 21st, 2015 at 3:30 a.m. And in the immortal words of Monty Python, he is no more. He has ceased to exist. He has gone on to meet his maker. He is an ex-Kirby, and we will miss him. Kirby was born in Louis, Iowa, but got to Texas as soon as he could convince his parents that it was the only place big enough to hold his personality. He spent the next 30 years in Houston, working as a reporter for the Houston Chronicle, owning a pet store, editing for a small poetry press, working as a travel agent, and taking on the man. I met Kirby in Houston, and we soon moved to Miami. But they weren't ready for Kirby. And so we moved back to Houston. We went. After we got back to Houston, Tristan joined our life. And we took him and we moved to East Texas, where Kirby edited a small town newspaper that wasn't quite ready for Kirby yet. So he had to go to a little bit bigger town and work for the Athens Daily Journal as a reporter. While working there, Kirby broke several national stories. He found the Bobby Sherry compound. And if you all don't know who Bobby Sherry was, he killed 4 black boys in Alabama in the 60s. And he found him. He rooted him out. And the FBI came in. And that was the kind of work Kirby did. In Athens, Texas, a town of what, 1,500? So Athens wasn't quite big enough for Kirby either, so here we came to Northwest Arkansas and seemed to grow around us. We came here in 1998, and he worked with Morning News as an editor and a reporter for the first 15 years we were here. And, you know, he took on everybody here, as most of you know. Kirby was an explorer. It was one of his things. Even at a young age, he was an explorer. One day while he was napping, his mom laid down for her own nap and woke to the phone ringing to tell her that Kirby was 12 blocks away across a busy street, just visiting with the folks at the funeral parlor. He was 2, and he was on hold the rest of his life. He traveled all over Europe, Mexico, the United States, and Belize was a particular favorite of his. He spent time in it. Kirby, he was a dying breed. In the words of Hunter S. Thompson, too weird to live and too rare to die. He was a Renaissance man with an IQ and a memory large enough to hold all of his knowledge. He was an old-fashioned reporter, and those of you who knew him knew never to call him a journalist. Because that's for fancy folks with degrees. He was a poet, an artist, a musician, a historian, photographer, rabble-rouser, leather worker, novelist, reporter, gun collector, radio announcer, teacher, priest, father, son, brother, uncle, and friend. Kirby had such a wide-ranging and seemingly divergent interest that some people thought he had multiple personalities. But in reality, there was only one really, really large personality. He was just Kirby. He was first and foremost, though, of all those things, he was a writer. It was not just his profession or his passion, but what he was deep down in his soul. Kirby could no more not write than he could not talk politics. It was just part of who he was. He had written and published 5 books of poetry, 2 novels, 1 history, which was the Guide to Butterfield Coach Trail, and countless news stories, short stories, and poems. Anything Kirby set his eye on, he became an expert on, whether it was Buddhism or the Butterfield Coach Trail. We always joked about Kirby that if you asked him for the time, he'd explain the history of timekeeping and then maybe tell you the time. He did nothing by that. But his pride and his joy and his true love were his children, Tristan and Guy. He didn't always know how to show his love, but he always loved them. he's always proud of. Kirby instilled in them a question all authority set of values. He tried to teach us to question all authority but mine. They took a little too much after their father and began to question his and my authority by the time they could walk. So, I met Kirby in 1988, and we've been friends ever since. We had our ups and downs, but we always knew we could count on each other. Kirby was my friend. Whenever anybody, a government agency, a business, an individual, were not doing what they were supposed to, I would give them a chance to straighten up, or well, I could always call my ex-husband, Kirby Sanders. 90% of the time, they straightened up. The other 10% of the time, they learned who Kirby Sanders really was. But that was the kind of Kirby power Kirby really had, and he wore it well. In the time I knew him, he took out the KKK, at least 2 dirty sheriffs, an entire municipal government, and the world at large. Kirby thought life should be fair and equitable, and fought against anyone and anything that kept it from being fair and equitable. Most of the time with his mightiest weapon, his pen. Kirby wrote news articles, editorials, letters, and poems fighting the man. He was involved in the peace and justice movement since the 60s, and it was showing no signs of slowing down in the mid-60s. Kirby was an idiot himself. He was one of the most self-confident people I ever knew. He had been called an arrogant mother by almost everyone he knew at least once, and more than once by those of us that knew him well. But that confidence attracted people to him. It also repelled folks as if they'd been bitten by a snake, which in some cases they had. Kirby didn't back down from a fight, especially when he knew he was right, which was most of the time, unfortunately. But Kirby's influence is beyond remarkable. On his Facebook alone, he had over 1,600 friends, literally hundreds of which came out to support us at the announcement of his death. His way of swaying people, motivating them, and inspiring them was incredible. Even though physically he is no longer with us, he is a permanent resident of the hearts of possibly thousands. His words, his actions, even his bullheaded stubbornness will be remembered forever, and he will not be forgotten. I would like to invite anybody who would like to say a word about Kirby up now. Beautiful.